Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. The Road to Autonomy is brought to you in part by Stantec Generation AV. Stantec Generation AV combines some of the most experienced AV experts in the industry with the resources of a global engineering firm. Stantec Generation AV provides education, consulting, assessment, and guidance to any industry interested in autonomous vehicles. Learn more at stantec.com. Hello and welcome to the Road to Autonomy. I'm your host, Grayson Brulte. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to welcome Lee White, founder and president, LM White Consulting. Lee, welcome to the podcast.
Grayson, thanks for having me.
Lee, I'm excited to have you here. Most importantly, you're a friend, but you're Mr. Logistics, and at certain times during your career, you played everybody's friend known as Saint Nick, otherwise known as Santa Claus, ensuring that packages were delivered to all these millions of kids around the world that needed it because you put the time in and sacrifices at UPS to ensure that packages were delivered on time and there was gifts under the Christmas tree. For that, as a father, I thank you. Lee, during your time at UPS, you were there 38 years. You had one heck of a run. And then after that incredible run, you said, no, I'm not going to retire. No. Lee's just getting started. You jumped full-time into the autonomous trucking industry. Why?
Yeah, Grayson, great story, great career. Started as a driver at UPS, was trained as a driver. But it really goes back to my first ride on an AV truck. I remember in 2018. At the time, my role at UPS was leading the transportation technology group. And I was actually part of a strategy team that had evaluated AV trucking back in 2015. And most of the players in that space back then were some of the DARPA Challenge holdover folks. They were looking at it from a robotic standpoint and mechanical and OEM. And in 2018, I had the opportunity to ride on a level 4 truck. And for an hour and a half, the driver never had to take control, never had to re-engage. And that was a wake-up moment. I remember standing outside that truck and looking back at it and say, you know, I'm never going to be able to look at trucking the same way. Now, that's prior to that point, I was a skeptic. I was almost proud that none of the resources I had were in jumping into that AV R&D pit, where it was sucking a lot of people into it, but I didn't think it was going to be in my lifetime. I didn't see it happening. So that was a significant change and moment for me that ultimately led to me making a career change from UPS into the AV trucking industry.
With some of that early skepticism, since you started as a driver, you experienced driving the world's most famous brown trucks around. Was that where some of that skepticism started because you saw what happens on the roads?
Yeah, you grow up in that world and you just look at it and say, there's no way that the computer can replace that functionality, the engagement with the customers and the skills that the drivers have. It was really something that I was just skeptical of. I just didn't think it was going to happen in my lifetime and pushed it out and said, we'll save that for somebody else after I leave UPS. So yeah, that's the source of it. And it was, I had done a number of pilots with platooning and some other technology programs that we were testing. So I was very pro-technology. It was just that huge leap to autonomous trucking that just didn't seem doable until really when you look at it, started in about 2015 and 2016 when the compute got to a level that people started looking at that autonomous trucking and driving as more of an information problem and processing issue than it was mechanical and robotic solutions. So that's what kind of opened up that window, opened my eyes to it, and again, began that journey.
There's a lot of parallels there because and you're gonna have to correct me if I'm wrong on this, that a UPS truck can't take a left turn. If my research is right, it only takes a right. And then if you look at autonomy, the big breakthrough was unprotected left-hand turns. That's been solved. That's been accomplished. We're doing it on the trucking side when you get off a highway. But on the pass car side, Waymo, Cruise, and for that, they're doing it every day in cities around the United States. Was that another breakthrough moment when, this vehicle can then take a left-hand turn from all your experience? It was always a right-hand turn?
Absolutely. So at UPS, when we design routes and the delivery order that the drivers go on, we design it right turns only. It's safer, it's more efficient, and we basically set up all the routes that way. I did view the holy grail as that unprotected left turn. Would you ever be able to do it? We can take a truck 16 to 18 seconds to clear an intersection when they're taking a left-hand turn. It's a long process. A passenger vehicle, probably 6 to 8 seconds to execute that left turn. So it was a significant performance milestone, in my opinion, to be able to execute that unprotected left turn. So, yeah, that is a big comparison. And again, from a safety standpoint, I think the orientation and the ability to perceive far enough to be able to execute that maneuver is a big accomplishment for the industry.
There's another parallel there, which is really interesting, because during your time at UPS, I said you played Saint Nick because your part of your job was to keep the routes running optimally for your customers, UPS's customers, to ensure that their packages were delivered on time. And in my opinion, more importantly, it kept the reputation and brand of UPS intact as a reliable delivery service that millions of individuals around the United States can count on. And then on the trucking side, on the autonomous truck side, you have several companies that are focused on, we don't really care about that. We don't care about generating revenue. We don't care about on time. We care about creating the world's best demo. And then on the others, then there's a very few companies, very small, that are focused on generating revenue, finding the right routes, and saying, okay, we have a potential economic downturn. We're focused on revenue. Why is there that divide in the autonomous trucking industry when your biggest competitor, sorry to say, FedEx, you had one common goal: make money, appease shareholders. No matter FedEx, UPS, you want to deliver on time and make money. On Autonomy, it says, on one side, best demo, money. It's not going to work out too well with that model.
Again, I arrived a little late to the party of AV. A lot of these companies had already put into motion where they were. And frankly, there weren't many truckers sitting at the table. In fact, there weren't any. So you had a lot of independent decisions. These AV companies anchored to different locations. Some chose academic environments like Pittsburgh and Toronto that had some operations set up there. Others anchored to the startup areas, the tech pool and the talent pool, like in Silicon Valley and the investment. Others looked at it more for where they had more positive regulations for testing, and maybe Arizona, Texas, and Florida. And nobody really looked at it from the trucker perspective, which is, where does it make sense to put autonomous lanes in? It was much more focused on the immediate needs of the AV testing companies and how they were going to develop and mature their products and test it. So it's been a journey, right? The initial few years of AV development really wasn't looking for profitability. Trucking is a very low margin business. I use the phrase pennies on the dollar. We'll always be focused on business decisions first. You don't have that luxury or that ability to spend a lot of money on tech for tech's sake. You just can't do it. You don't have the margins to do it. So you're right. I think what is beginning to happen, and the market changed with the investment community, is there's been a much bigger focus on commercialization. How do you develop the cash flow? And how are you going to have unit economics that work? How is it going to be profitable? How does that play out in your roadmaps and the mathematical approach to make the unit economics work? So I think you're seeing both move towards each other as far as the trucking attitude penetrating and getting into the AV space.
Because on the traditional trucking side, margins are historically very small. I'll give you two large carriers. J.B. Hunt currently operates at a 6.4% margin. Werner operates at a 4.8% margin. You use the term pennies on the dollar. I use the term holy cow, the old Phil Rizzuto. That's a very small margin. Apple operates north of 40% in some cases. How will companies like that embrace autonomous trucking? They obviously know how to run operations on such things. They understand cash management. How are they going to operate this when the certain autonomy guys are just sitting there lighting cash on fire?
So a couple things, right? Part of it is having to do with the economics we're in now versus where we were a couple of years ago. 2 years ago, for every 100 trucks that a company had, they had about 120 loads that needed to be moved. We were way short in our supply of trucking. And frankly, AV got a lot of attention back then because that was how these fleets were going to be able to handle that spike. If they could get some AV lanes up and running, then they would be able to take some of those drivers and move them out to get the excess capacity that needed to get moved. So it was a very tight market as far as having capacity to move. But when you look at the fleets and how they establish themselves and how they manage those margins, it is a very complicated network. It's specific niche plays. I don't care whether you look at the dedicated fleets, the intermodal, or the over the road or the brokerage operations. These fleets know exactly the dials to touch and turn and where they've got opportunity to improve their margins. We've seen a lot of recent reports, companies that report in some of those segments, 88% to 90%. Now they're up at 98%. Even some have reported losses. One carrier reported recently a $25 million loss. That is really, really tight. And when you look at the economies and the economics of running a trucking company, 40 to 44% of that cost is driver wages and benefits. And that becomes the area of opportunity. That's what has put all this energy in the autonomous world to really look at that from an economic standpoint, as well as 17% that goes to the fueling of the vehicles. You've got a tremendous opportunity to impact that. There's a lot of opportunity in the dollars that get spent by those fleets that they're looking as far as how to embrace that. How do they take advantage of that? And that's what gets these fleets looking at that industry for the opportunities.
What impact is the driver shortage? The American Trucking Association has published really in-depth research on it. What impact does that play? And I want to highlight this on the backside, that it's very important to highlight this. Autonomous trucking will create jobs. And we have data from the Volpe Center. The United States Department of Transportation even backs me up on that statement. So that's very important to highlight there.
Yeah, exactly. So the shortage is a huge issue, right? A lot of these trucking companies have become very good and developed a core competency to maintain staffing levels. They have large recruiting departments. They have a lot of people that are committed to that effort of keeping themselves staffed. And the autonomous trucking industry, when you talk to the leaders in that space, they are very pro-driver. Autonomous trucking does not work without drivers. They're critical. Those new jobs, that's real jobs. You're going to have inspections that need to be done. Who's best qualified to do that? That's going to be people that are driving those trucks. You're going to have a lot of difficult scenarios right now in the over-the-road market. I may spend 70 hours out on the road, but I may be only driving for 40 hours or 50 hours of that 70 hours. There's a lot of things that I have to do to make sacrifices in order to be out there and be running in the wild, to be able to support myself. And AV opens up that opportunity to really improve that work-life balance, to make it much more of a desirable job and help us with that driver shortage. Put the resources where we need to take more volume, to take more of these autonomously moved loads.
I agree with you. And then if you look at the launch pad jobs, you mentioned the inspection, but you can have an individual that their chief launch pad officer, for example, or vice president of launch pad operations, because they have the experience, they know what to do when they're looking at the truck, very similar to the way that a pilot goes around a plane at a commercial airport today. They inspect the plane. The launch pad operator will do that as well. And I think a lot about the economic impact that's not discussed a lot. These individuals you mentioned, they're on the road 70 hours. They might only be driving 40 to 50, and it's very hard on the body. And it's been well documented, the medical costs associated with that, the mental health costs associated with that. But imagine if that individual can go to, say, the depot or the AV launch site. They work 9 to 5 and another shift comes in, say, from 5 to 2 and does the overnight, for example. Then they go home and they can go to church on Sunday. They can go to Little League on Saturday. They're higher paying jobs, and perhaps they're going out for dinner once a week in that local community. That's having economic stimulus. Or they invested in a hot dog stand, or they do this. Then you start to having these really interesting economic pockets of wealth and boom that start to grow up. That becomes really interesting.
Yeah. So look at the dynamics. Let's say you're a driver and I'm going to ask you to move a load from the Port of Savannah to Dallas. That's about 1,100 miles. You're going to come in on, let's say, Monday morning. You're going to pick up your truck at the terminal. You're going to check off on some maintenance items. You're going to work your way over to the port. You're going to be standing in lines, clearing that, looking and finding your load. You may finally leave that port about 11 o'clock in the morning, and out of your 11 hours, you've only got 7 or 8 hours left to be on the road. So you're going to bid down somewhere in Alabama, close to Birmingham. You'll pay $15 to take a shower. You're going to get yourself set up, bid down on your truck, wake up the next morning, move that load towards Dallas. You'll bid down again on the outskirts of Dallas, try to find a place to eat. And finally, when you wake up on Wednesday, you'll find a way to deliver that load and make your appointment time. And then you start that chain all over again. Odds are there's not something going back to Savannah. Your dispatcher may send you out to South Cal to pick up a load, or to Memphis or Chicago. And it's going to take you days, if not weeks, to work your way back to your home. So you're going to be away from your family. You're going to be making all these sacrifices. But if we can flip that over and create it in that autonomous world where Monday morning at 8 o'clock, that load is on a launching pad, it gets dispatched, and 17 hours later, it lands on the outskirts of Dallas. And the Savannah driver, you're making local runs back and forth to the DCs and to that area, or you're the Dallas driver, you're working consistent hours, you're making those deliveries at 8 in the morning till 11 in the morning, and you're off work every day at 5 p.m. You've got a much better work-life balance. We've got a better environment for you. There's been inspection jobs, there's been oversight jobs, there's been rescue jobs that have been added to that network. So you've got this whole ecosystem support that the DOT report does prove out. It's going to be an increase of somewhere between 25 and 35,000 new jobs into that market. So there's a lot of benefits that's going to happen by that conversion to AV. You're also going to see a significant amount of traffic increase. I think it's a lot like the intermodal operations.
You're right about that, but think about the positivity on that quality of life. The quality of life, you highlighted it a little, but I want to emphasize the quality of life of those drivers is going to go through the roof. And the launch pad and the operations and the local drivers, well, frankly, they'll probably be higher paying jobs as well. And you're not going to incur all those costs that you're incurring being out over the road. Do you see autonomous trucking evolving from a hub-to-hub strategy where autonomous trucking, so you're going to go from, say, Port of Savannah to Dallas, Fort Worth, and that will be fully autonomous. And then when you're in those local communities, either it goes in a GATTEC type operation or they're human driven depending on the complex of the environment?
Absolutely, Grayson. I don't ever see an environment where you don't have drivers. You are going to need the drivers on the front end of that, making the pickups every day. There's going to be dozens of jobs in each one of these markets of just making these pickups and bringing these loads back to these truck ports, if you will. And same on the delivery side, that customer contact and these fleets that have these customer relationships in these niche markets they play to, you're always going to need those touch points. So I do think that messy middle mile portion is the one that's most adapted in the AV market. And again, I want to make it very similar to the intermodals. Intermodal started back in the 50s. There was just a few hundred a day. In the 60s, that grew to about 3,000 a day. And Dave Beck, the president of the Teamsters, he was actually Jimmy Hoffa's predecessor, said, I absolutely see this has a definite place in the future of transport, but it should only be used when it has the most efficient means for the shipper. And I think that's exactly the same attitude we'll have for AV lanes and where loads should be moving from an autonomous standpoint. You know, intermodal is one of the better trucking jobs as far as moving loads back and forth to the rail. The hardest part is the delays that the drivers incur when they interact with the rails and, again, make that same feeds with the customers. So there's a lot of opportunity. Right now, when you look at intermodals, we're over 50,000 units moving per day. It's a $55 billion market, and it's good jobs, and it created thousands of trucking jobs. And that's what AV has that opportunity to do is as you convert those lanes, just like there's a rail movement from Southern California to the Dallas metro area, you'd see that same opportunity for AV run from Atlanta into Dallas, with the bookends of that being driver jobs, delivery and pickup operations that are those good work-life balance, the mental health benefits, the ability to have good fixed schedules and repeatable operations that frankly don't exist in the over-the-road market right now. It is a very difficult lifestyle for a driver to be on the road with that type of dynamic going on.
Highlight intermodal. JB Hunt has an extremely large intermodal business. In fiscal year 22, they did $7 billion in revenue for intermodal. And I want to put that in context. That's roughly 50% of their overall $14.81 billion in revenue. And you mentioned the intermodal loads. JB Hunt did 2 million intermodal loads in 2022. That's a very big business for them. Do you think that's why Mr. Craig Harper, is so interested in autonomy, because of the role that intermodal plays in JB Hunt's business, as I said, making up roughly 50% of their fiscal year 2022 revenue?
Absolutely. I think the ability for fleets to expand their use of intermodal is capable through some of the AV applications. Right now, there's a sweet spot, depending on which fleet you talk to and look at, but somewhere between 60 and 120 miles. And again, you can expand that. If we could get that to 120 to 240 miles, instead of just serving the immediate area of Dallas, all of a sudden you've got Shreveport within reach. You've got Houston, you've got San Antonio, you've got new markets, Laredo, that could literally be connected with the intermodal train solution, but also have an AV component where you've got loads going back and forth from maybe Laredo feeding into Dallas that are connected to the intermodal scheme. So absolutely, it's an opportunity to expand the intermodal connection. And again, it's one of those scenarios where it's train, truck, and AV, where 1 + 1 + 1 can equal 5 as far as an output for a better supply chain, more emission conscious supply chain, as well as better work-life balance for the drivers that are supporting that. And I think what happens is, because of that reduced cost portfolio, you bring more movement into that, you bring more consistency into that supply chain, and you basically establish a very stable network system that can handle more spikes and valleys as far as some of the demand flows that we're seeing right now with this economy we're in.
The economy we're in is topsy-turvy, I think is the term I'll use. I use the word topsy-turvy. We had a good report out of JP Morgan today that the spot market might have bottomed, which will be very positive for the trucking industry. I've said this before, and I'll say this again. I'm going to go on the record. At some point, a Class 1 railroad will buy an autonomous trucking company. When that will happen, I don't know, but I truly believe at some point, a Class 1 railroad will buy an autonomous trucking company to extend their intermodal operations and create what I'm calling a virtual railroad. We have examples from history there. When Jay Gould was owning Union Pacific, when Clark Gable, and they wanted to expand to Sun Valley, put Clark Gable on there to build a brand. There's a lot of ways from history that we can learn from. On the economic situation, we are on the verge of a potential recession or an economic downturn. Use the term you want. I'll use the term topsy-turvy because we don't know where we're going. We have a debt ceiling issue we're going on. Either way, we're under economic stress. So as we go into economic stress, the industry, from the autonomous trucking standpoint, is going to have a hard time raising capital just because of the rising interest rate environment that are going to hold steady for a while now. But Chairman Powell came out and said if they have to lower to stimulate the economy, they will lower. So a little dovish tone there. How will the industry survive this potential downturn? What type of consolidation will we see? I have some theories on it, but I'd love to get yours before I dive into mine.
I think you're going to see some consolidations, right? This number system, again, I go back to this supply-demand, 120 trucks worth of loads to move. Now you may have 85 or 90, and you're very focused on this week's loads counts and this month's cost control and how are we going to do for earnings. Again, AV is kind of a nice to have right now because we have to weather this storm and we have to get through this. The end product here of what fleets are going to have to do is really, we've got to manage through this and we've got to get to the bottom. I agree with you that we may have seen the bottom in the spot rates, but we also got to understand the impact of what's getting pulled through. Target and Home Depot just recently announced some of the drop in demand for their goods. Like Target's achievement in their sales forecast was done through necessities, but they saw like a double-digit drop in furniture and clothes. And that's what fills up our trucks. Absolutely, it's on essentials and the movement of groceries and that type. But the economic realities and what's going to take place here, we need to keep the pricing discipline where it needs to be, but it is a very difficult market right now. We've got far too much supply right now in the trucking world for the demand that's out there. And we've got to do that much better from a government standpoint, catching that, making sure that we see these indicators. We were probably late in seeing the need to raise interest rate. We allowed some things to happen there. So we got to get better at seeing that for the future and make sure that we make good macro decisions. But the micro level decisions for each one of these trucking companies is going to be very focused on making good decisions here and keeping the right disciplines up. Some of these customers are calling these fleets multiple times and asking for haircuts on some rates. So if everybody's looking for how they can squeeze cost out of the system, that's a high priority right now. And there's a number of things that we're still dealing with from the pandemic that are complications of that. We got behind in the ability for new trucks to enter the market. So some fleets aged. So instead of having a 3 or 4 year old fleet, I've got a average age of 4, 5, or 6 years. And maintenance costs went up by 8%, 12%, 15%. And that impacts earnings per share. So there's a number of dynamics that are driving cost issues for these fleets, and we've got to really tighten our belts and make sure that we manage through this. And the demand that returns, we want to make sure it's balanced. What we don't want to see happen is what happened during the pandemic, which is this wild spike where all of a sudden all this supply came into the industry and it creates this highs and lows that just aren't sustainable for us.
They're not, and I'm going to say this very bluntly, transitory should be the new 4-letter word. There was no such thing as inflation being transitory. It's a 4-letter word. It's dirty. It's bad. There's no way around how to say that. So cost discipline, let's hope it's there. Pricing discipline, let's hope it's there. How are they going to maintain this? It's certain industries, they get really, really highs and they get drunk on the money. They spend it and they're like, uh-oh. It just seems that historically in industries, there's this pattern there. How can we maintain the cost discipline and the pricing discipline, especially as autonomy comes in? Because I want to highlight some economic figures here on why cost discipline and pricing discipline has to happen. JB Hunt currently only has $52 million in cash on hand. I repeat, only $52 million in cash on hand, while Werner has $129 million in cash on hand. That's not enough to upgrade the fleet to fully autonomous. How are they going to finance it? How are they going to maintain their cost discipline, pricing discipline, when you've got tech companies at Apple or Berkshire Hathaway, a multi-big conglomerate that's a trucking operation? They've got over $100 billion. I repeat, $100 billion in cash.
Yeah, and the way these fleets have built into their systems. So keep in mind that they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in de-risking their fleets and standardizing their fleet. So if they want a Cummins engine, they may use 2 OEMs, but they're going to have that same Cummins engine in both of those OEMs. It lowers their cost basis for parts that they have to keep in their supply. So there's a number of things that they will do internally to look at that to try to lower their cost structure. But there isn't a lot of capital sitting in these trucking companies that's not being used. They've baked in their fleet replacements, their business models for doing that. So the economy and what impact it's having on that, so you may see a squeeze on that. They may tighten that up and maybe not spend as much and defer by a year. Again, the focus is how do they manage their maintenance costs so that that doesn't come back in an operating expense that offsets what would have been a CapEx decision. But they've got to get prepared for this. I think if AV would have been deployed and operationalized, we could have held the line and helped a lot more in balancing out the spikes and valleys. And if you look at it, I look at our total trucking network. If you look at the US on the map, it's like it's a beard, right? It comes down California, goes across the Sunbelt states and goes back up. And there's this little goatee that goes up through Memphis to Chicago. But roughly 80% of freight moves in the top 20% lanes. So if AV could commercialize and have the density and the consistency in those main lanes, we can really stabilize from a cost control standpoint, just like the intermodal does for us in those rail lanes, that you've got a very attractive product from a cost per load standpoint that we can then manage and handle some of these spikes and valleys that happen during these economic disruptions. So it's a matter of stabilizing and getting that consistent cost and that consistent network that is running with AV. And then on the bookends, we're able to manage that with our driver levels and handle those spikes and valleys in demand and supply.
What are some of those main lanes? Obviously, and this is based on data that I've done independently, can't verify, but Dallas to Houston seems to be the most commonly trafficked autonomous trucking route. But what are the main lanes for profitability in the United States? Are there certain lanes when you're looking at a map and you're running an operations for a large trucking company or an AV company, say, okay, guys, these are the lanes where we're going to make money. These are the lanes we want to focus on. What are those lanes?
So, Grayson, for each fleet, they know exactly where they've got capacity and where they've got the opportunity and where that is. We could spend hours talking through about specific ones, but really what I would tell you is the attractiveness of taking the AV routes and where the testing is and overlaying that with the attractive trucking lanes. And you're going to see that across the 13 states in the Sun Belt. You're going to see that in, let's call it the I-10, the I-20, the I-40 corridor, and then the key north-south routes, 95, 75, 35 as it comes through. That's where you're going to see the beginning of the operations. I can't think of a single freight company that I've talked to that had enough capacity in the Laredo up to Dallas and beyond market. That's a prime lane that needs a lot of capacity. That's a prime opportunity where you've got both some AV resources in that area and testing, and you've also got this big need from the fleets, both whether it's FTL and you've got LTL with the big need. Everybody's got a need of coming up from Laredo into the transporter operations and bringing that up to the markets in the U.S. So that's what I think you're going to start seeing is this overlap of taking some of the trucking data and where fleets see their opportunity and start shifting some of their resources now in the manual mode so that when AV does deploy in those spaces, they're ready. They're prepared. They can handle their customer base. They've got their consistency of freights. They've done their homework, and they begin to build AV lane focused opportunities where they can experience the profitability that you talk about. They experience the reduced costs due to the benefits of the AV, but they're ready to serve the customer. They're ready to handle it with the drivers that they have available at the front and the back end of that. And it becomes a win. We've seen some wild changes in price points. It used to be over $3 from a Midwest move down to Laredo. Now it may be $1.50 per mile. Tremendous changes that you don't want to make long-term network decisions off that, but you've got to be aware of where that capacity is, where that trend is, and where the demand is going to be for the consumers who are moving this product and moving these loads. Where does that future growth need to take place?
How much traffic today, this is historical, traditional trucking, goes cross-border? Is it a lot of traffic? Is it limited traffic? How much of that goes cross-border, the United States-Mexico border?
Yeah, a ton. Some of the latest border sites I was checking on, there's thousands of loads that come across, right? Inspection borders have been a big issue as far as just some of the delays. I was reading recently, we've got somewhere between an 8 and 27-hour delay as you cross that inspection point. And that's one of the highlights that I saw recently for an operational advancement for an AV trucking company. They actually demonstrated on video and showed that whole interaction with an inspection point. But between rails and trucks, you've got roughly 20,000 loads coming across just in that Texas corridor there, Laredo. That's a ballpark number, depending on which commodity. Not all of that is trucking friendly volume, but you've got a significant movement each day that comes across that port and will continue. Recently, the Kansas City Canadian Pacific merge gives us a rail connection that goes from border to border. That's the first time we've seen that in the rail. That's exciting. That's a new development that creates a lot of opportunity. And AV trucking could give us the same capability of literally border to border capability of moving freight. I was talking with one customer that was having to spend almost $14,000 for sleeper team moving from produce movement from South California to the Canadian border. Just some incredible price points that go into that lane.
I'm going to put my me being Grayson hat on. Rail from Canton City Southern and Canada. It makes a lot of sense. You go from Canada to the United States to Mexico. That's going to be a very big financial economic boon for them. Barron's actually had a nice piece on the synergies there today. But me being Grayson, and I think a lot about this, you're going to put an autonomous truck into Mexico. Unfortunately, you read the news and there's cartel incidents. These trucks are very expensive. They could be held hostage and sold for a lot of money on the black market because those parts are worth a fortune, especially when the cartel figures out, which they probably already have, the value of the GPUs in those vehicles. How big of a concern is that? The rail's no problem there. Good luck trying to kidnap a rail. But to take an autonomous truck, rip out the GPU, sell it, the truck's dead on arrival right there. Have we thought that issue through?
I think some of them have. We still have more homework to do. What's the security protocols that are going to be in place? How are you going to maintain those sites? I think the focus that I'm aware of the AV companies is they'll deal with the trailers once they cross into the U.S. and pick them up from there. So it's more of a U.S. issue. But there's still things that will need to be standardized and engineered for safety and security, for all those things that you think about. I think AV trucking can help us with the human trafficking issue. There's things the cameras will pick up. There's data that will be available with trailer numbers and information that can be exponentially used to enhance security and protect all of us, both the consumers, the unsuspecting public, as well as those that are involved in, let's just say that we keep the safe.
You're right with the human trafficking. Unfortunately, I looked into that. That's a bigger problem than we're willing to admit. And you're right. No more funny business when the truck's running autonomous with all the cameras. You're going to be able to pick things up and save lives. That's what they're going to do. They're going to save lives, and hopefully the cameras are going to be used to catch these bad criminals, because they are criminals that are engaging in human trafficking. It's disgusting. It's wrong in that front. Going back to lanes, how do you determine a good lane from a bad lane? Is it distance? Is it profitability? Is it the availability of freight? What determines a good lane from a bad lane?
So I'd answer that really two ways. From an AV perspective, looking at that, it's how much investment do you have to make into that lane to make it operational for you? What are the local constraints? What needs to be there? So I think what you'll see from an AV perspective at looking at, let's call them AV friendly lanes, good operating conditions, weather conditions, traffic conditions. You want the best of the best if you can influence that and control that. For the fleets and the network decisions, again, you've got to look at the entire composition of that lane. What capacity do you have in the area? What assets do you have? What's your customer base? What's your agreements? What's the length of those agreements as far as you're growing into those areas in a profitable way for you? So you're going to see right now, every trucking company, they'll have an intermodal division. They've got an over-the-road division. They've got a dedicated division. I think what you'll start seeing here in the next few months is autonomous divisions. And you'll start seeing planning to start happen like that. What are the right lanes that we want to focus on from a AV adoption standpoint? Which ones make sense for us? And they begin to optimize their network around that, both from a planning standpoint and from a future execution standpoint, and begin to make move towards that. So this is a long-term, I say 24 to 36 month cycle to get ready for that. And the goal here would be for the fleets that go through that process of evaluating what makes a good lane to do that in sync with the AV deployment plans. So as AV trucking companies bring lanes on, the fleets are ready. They're ready from an asset standpoint. They know what they have to do from a launch pad, landing pad, drayage standpoint, customer feeds. All of those operational constraints are worked on together so that you can adapt and implement the right lanes with the right integration level at the right time for your company.
Okay, how important is infrastructure on those AV lanes? Can infrastructure that's already been built be reused as it has to be repurposed? Because we talked about launch pads, we talked about depots. It's infrastructure.
Yeah, and frankly, we're behind on that. It's a very unknown. There's not a consistent standard out there yet. So you've got each one of the AV companies kind of doing that on their own. How are they going to launch and land? You've got infrastructure. Everybody's built some facilities. So there's probably 400,000 facilities out there that have yard movements and loads that come in and out. But what you'll see at first is more of a generic truck terminal that will open up the opportunity to have perhaps multiple AV companies operate out of the same location. There's movement towards that. Let's call them generic truck ports that will be able to do that. They will need the infrastructure that supports all the different AV companies. How do they do that? How do they launch them? How do they land them and get the consistency? But Grayson, there's not a lot of people that have done some future proofing, if you will, and getting prepared for that. Hillwood has done a little bit of that in the Alliance area. They're prepared for that. But there's some things that, if you just talk about the reality, how do you get pedestrians from the parking lot into the buildings? How do you do that if you've got autonomous trucks coming in and out? Very few facilities have bridges where people will walk across in and out of their facilities. So there's a lot of work on that. Conduit out to the area. Do you have GPS line of sight and coverage with the satellites? Do you have the data feeds that you need out to those locations? There's a lot of things like that that are going to be practical infrastructure that you've got to put in place out there in order to enable AV loads to launch and land from those locations. I think there's a lot of work we need to do in the supply chain to get prepared for that. It reminds me back maybe 15 years ago, we saw this explosion of these fulfillment and distribution centers that were much larger than what we're used to. 500,000, 800,000, million square foot facilities. And we didn't really do a good job of designing the inbound and outbound yard operations. So you had this incredible throughput inside the buildings, but then you had trucks lined up for an hour or 2 hours trying to get on property or trying to figure out where they had to go get their loads and so that they could leave and get on the road. And it became a real pinch point for those operations. They had all this firepower inside four walls, but they couldn't get the trucks on property. And we need to avoid that. We finally figured that out. We're much better at that. We don't have those long queue lines, and there's bypass procedures and all sorts of things we can do. But that infrastructure to support yard operations in conjunction with these big facilities that are out there. I read recently we've got a 1.5 million square foot facility in South Dallas. That is a huge building. And that never would have been able to happen without automation inside those four walls. But we need to make sure that we're ready outside those four walls, and we future-proof that for future autonomous missions that may come in and land and launch from a location like that.
You're right. I want to highlight something that Mr. Steven Schwartzman, chairman, CEO, and co-founder of Blackstone, recently stated. Mr. Schwartzman said that vacancies are minuscule, rent growth is strong, and new supply is rapidly declining in the warehouse space. I repeat, rent growth is strong and new supply is rapidly declining in the warehouse space. What Mr. Schwartzman clearly states is that there's pricing power. Does that lead to another pinch point because Blackstone has pricing power and a lot of these warehouses aren't equipped to accept deliveries from autonomous trucks yet?
Right. So you want to make sure you're ready, right? Because if you're not ready, you're going to devalue your property. So you're going to see some movements from there. I think you've seen it. Prologis, Hillwood, Altera, CBRE. There's a lot of the large players in the real estate side, in the industrial space, that are aware of that. Grayson, I like to talk about this march, and I do this with my clients. I use the bullseye concept. And there's three rings that these big players in e-commerce and distribution are focused on. One is the inside the walls that we just talked about. Robots, automation, tugs, RFID. You've got grocery stores that are really focused on their distribution centers. I live on an island in Florida, and I can order Kroger and get it delivered to my house here from a automated warehouse near Orlando that winds up on trucks that gets here. And there's not a Kroger store within 100 miles of my house. They do that through the use of inside automation. So you've got DHL just announced recently 5,000 Locust robots that they're purchasing. These e-logistics and e-commerce players are getting very comfortable with robots and automation inside their four walls. And I want to make another point. It's the same issue with the driver comments about autonomous trucking. It's not lowering the number of employees that they're hiring inside these facilities. It's giving them more throughput, more capacity, and more consistency. They can process more, and people are doing very different things than they used to do in the manual warehouses. But it's truly giving them consistent throughput and supply chain resiliency so they can handle spikes and valleys and get into new markets. I mean, this is, if you think about it, not having a Kroger grocery store within 100 miles, but still being able to buy Kroger groceries is a huge leap for them. And that's a capability that's taken place because of this adoption of autonomy and robotics and automation and machine learning and AI and what's taken place inside the buildings. So all that inside the four-wall investment has taken place. And what you're going to see pivot over the next 18 to 36 months is now we're going to go outside the four walls, but we're going to look at on-property applications. So you're going to start seeing yard autonomy, autonomous movement of goods, trailer moves on property between doors and staging yards. You're going to see it in airport operations and ground support equipment that you can control the safety case in your employees. It's still on your property. We're not into the public domain. We're not on public roads yet. You're going to see it in the agricultural applications and autonomy there. You're going to see it in mining operations, in fracking operations. So all these off-road applications and shuttle buses, and you're going to see that take place. That's that next ring of autonomy adoption that's going to take place as we're all focused on that 800 billion trucking adoption market that will happen as we keep moving down towards this bullseye. So that's what I predict will happen is you're going to see more of this on-property movement, not a pervasive move out on public roads. That'll be a very deliberate, incremental, lane-by-lane adoption that will take place. Probably not as fast as we thought it would happen 3 years ago, but it's still going to start to happen. I just think you'll see much more energy and commitment to specific focused use cases of on-property application of autonomy.
The focused use cases is what Gatik has down to a science, but I want to get back to the Kroger. Kroger has a partnership with Gatik. They're increasing operational efficiency. That's a huge leap. That's going to lead to revenue increase. That's going to lead to profitability increase. Then you're going to have shareholders awarding with the increase in the stock price because of what you're doing. So Kroger's doing that. They've automated inside the warehouse. You mentioned on-property autonomy. I'm assuming that's a lot of the yard dogs and moving the trailers around the property. How can the infrastructure be upgraded? You mentioned individuals that are, do you have to build overpasses? Do you have to build, okay, east side of the building is for human-driven trucks, west side of the building is for autonomous trucks. What does that look like from, let's call it, AV infrastructure upgrade assessment?
So geofence it, right? So there's going to be a perimeter, right? It's how close is your tolerance level for the intersection between an autonomously driven truck and the humans that will be entering your property or taking care of it. So you're going to have geofences where if a human penetrates a certain area, it will impact that operation. And essentially the truck will stop and call for help. So that has to be thought through. And I do think you're going to see isolated operations where not everybody who's shifting on a yard is going to have access to where The AV trucks will be landing. It'll be cordoned off. It'll be fenced area, and certain certified people will be able to shift in that space. I mean, it's going to be a very controlled issue. Think of it like an airplane that pulls into an airport right now. There's wing walkers and there's communication people that are giving hand signals to the pilot. They place chocks as soon as the plane stops and they shut down the engine. Everybody holds their hands up. You're going to see that same type of certification on a mission that comes in and landed. Very limited exposure points as far as who will be the humans that will intersect with them, and specific behavior predicted patterns that will be acceptable into the autonomy stack and how it operates when it integrates. But I think there's a lot more work to do on that. I think what will happen first, we've seen some things, some movements like Pilot in the truck stop world, right? You'll see some of these dedicated AV trucking terminals that will be able to operate and handle that. And you'll temporarily take a small drayage expense of 3 or 4 or 5 miles to get it to its final destination. That will be a human-driven solution before you're able to future-proof and then start getting the volume of levels that will be bringing in those autonomous missions at those locations. But absolutely, a lot of work to do to get ready for that. What areas would you be launching and landing missions at some of these fulfillment centers and distribution centers? I think that's some exciting work streams that are facing us here over the next 10 to 15 years to get ready for that.
It's exciting work streams. I have to give a plug for the sponsor of this podcast, Stantec Generation AV. That's something that they're working on. So if you're interested, reach out to the team at Stantec Generation AV at stantec.com. They do a really good job of upgrading depots there. But what you described, Lee, in the words of Senator Scott, jobs, jobs, jobs. What you described is going to create jobs. You look at another company that they're doing really well, that they have a very public relationship with Walmart, is Gaddick Gaham. I'd love to know one day, sir, how you came out of stealth with a Walmart partnership. Perhaps you want to come on the podcast, sir, and talk about it. What are your thoughts on Gaddick's business model? They're going from a dark center to a distribution center to a store. It's working because they're generating revenue.
So you got to give a shout out to the 3 groups, companies that have commercialized with driver out. That is Waymo, Cruise, and Gaddick. They're demonstrating it. They are driver out. We're seeing, I loved one of the recent videos of the St. Patty's Days revelers walking around on the streets, and you watched a cruise vehicle navigate them safely. What we couldn't see is how much green beer they had in their hands, right? But we could absolutely see them just wandering around and being what we call in the business non-compliant performance. But the Gaddick business model is a niche model that is going to have specific focus use cases that works. The grocery store, the from a DC to a retail store for pickup, that is a very good focused use case that works, right? Because I'm going to make that delivery repeated pattern over and over again. And there's a lot of places out there and business models that need that, whether it's auto part deliveries, if it's consistent deliveries to parts, to hospitals, to medical supply. I mean, there's a bunch of business use cases where they have that repeated smaller truck. You know, it doesn't have to be a Class 8. It can be a 26-foot box truck that goes around and makes deliveries that does that. There's food distribution applications, whether it's fast food restaurants that need that or convenience stores. There are a ton of business use cases where that model works. It's consistent. You have the same pattern every day. You can set up the times of when you're going to run those operations to minimize your congestion. You've got a completely controllable ODD. You know, the challenge is who's going to unload it when it gets there. Today's world, you've got a driver, so you have to arrange for that. And then, of course, you've got to make sure it gets loaded at the DC before it leaves. But I think it's brilliant. I think there's some good use cases. And then it becomes, how do we optimize that, right? Right now, if I'm paying a driver and you can only do that 8 hours a day, well, if it's autonomously driven and if I've got people at the convenience store or I've got people who are sitting in the store or ready to receive the goods and offload it, I can run that 16 hours a day. I can run that 24 hours a day. I get to decide when that is, but I can just cycle that truck over and over again. So I think that is all part of this whole ecosystem that will get delivered and developed that will help us in the supply chain adopt, integrate, and scale these AV solutions.
You mentioned Waymo, Cruise, and Gatik. They're all generating revenue. Well, Gatik's focused on middle mile. Cruise and Waymo are focused on the passenger car business. What can the autonomous trucking industry learn from the passenger side of autonomous vehicles? They both have clear ambitions to generate billions of dollars of revenue and scale and go driver out. But is there something from your experience that they can learn from each other and vice versa?
I think what you're seeing now is this traction. We saw Phoenix. Phoenix had started in 2018 in a very limited territory. That was Waymo. And now here we are 5 years later. We've got all of Phoenix. You've got San Francisco. You've got LA. We've heard Austin. We're here in Dallas and Houston and New York. So you're getting traction. And so you're not hearing about R&D developments and new LiDAR announcements and new mounting solutions. They're hardening their product. They're getting the consistency, which they're going to start to see is better uptimes. You're hearing some milestones, 1,000,000 miles, some of these big milestones being crossed. And that's beneficial for everybody involved, the ecosystem, the uptime, the performance, the cost structure. But what I would want the AV trucking industry to take from the passenger car industry is that relentless focus on the commercialization. They are now getting a lot of traction. They understand what it takes to harden that product, to turn it into a product. And the product isn't really their software stack or anything. It's where they're going to be able to run AV. And that's the transition that I think you'll see the AV trucking company make here over the next few months is as they become more, people will announce feature ready, feature complete. It becomes not so much the AV stack and their equipment, but it becomes their ability to provide the service. And that's what those passenger, and they've gone through a number of transitions. Remember, it was going to be passenger car and you'll never have to drive if you're a high schooler. And then all of a sudden we got to the reality on the price point. You know, we drive 13,000 miles as consumers. There's 230 million drivers in the US. Nobody can pay $15 more per mile to put, 100,000 plus of equipment on their passenger car. It became a solution that didn't have a problem for. Nobody would buy that type of investment. And now they pivoted and they shifted to the robotaxi. But the drawback on the robotaxi, if you think about it, fully allocated, that TAM's about 40 billion, but the trucking market's 800 billion. Even if you add to that 40 billion of the ride-hail market, put all the food delivery in there, it may double it. But just a 3% penetration in the trucking market is worth more than 50% of that robotaxi market. And think of all the mapping and the cities you have to get ready in order to hit 50% of the robotaxi market. We've got a much more concentrated piece of dollars in the trucking market. And I think you're going to see the investors, you're going to see the AV companies become very aware of that. As there's more pressure to deliver revenue and profitability, you'll see even more pressure on where are those lanes? How do we get penetration to escalate into the trucking business to really so that we can experience all the benefits that you talked about in the supply chain with that?
The 80 billion TAM for autonomous trucking versus the 40 billion TAM for ride hailing, that's pretty significant. You're 100% right on the relentless focus on commercialization. I got to give a lot of credit to a wonderful gentleman, Gil West, who's the Chief Operating Officer at Cruise, former Chief Operating Officer at Delta Airlines. That gentleman, Mr. West, has completely done wonderful things to help Cruise scale. And you're seeing that Cruise is scaling faster than anybody thought was possible, scaling fastest in the industry with a relentless focus on commercialization and making revenue. In my opinion, Cruise will be the first autonomous vehicle company to generate $1 billion in year-over-year revenue, and Mr. West and Mr. Vogt will play a big part of that along with Mrs. Barr's support at GM. Well, there's a relentless focus on ride hail. I go, that's an okay market. It's an okay market today until you introduce augmented reality and experiences, which we saw with the announcement this week of BMW and Meta. And then the real money is going to come in when you introduce personally owned autonomous vehicles. And at some point, Tesla is going to figure that out, and that's going to become very, very interesting. That becomes a very big business there. for Tesla. But on the trucking side, with this relentless focus on commercialization, I go back to two companies. They're both in the Road to Autonomy Index, ticker Autonomy, Volvo AB and Daimler Truck. They have a relentless focus on commercialization. They're building redundant chassis. Volvo's introducing autonomous trucking solutions as a service. Daimler's got something cooking with Torg, now led by Peter von Schmidt. Does Volvo and Daimler become the Cruise and Waymo of autonomous trucking?
Grayson, that is a fantastic question. You've really done your homework. Nobody's getting a hall pass in this conversation today, so I appreciate that. So let's go backwards so that we can come forward, right? So go back 50 years ago, there were three verticals in the whole trucking ecosystem. One is you had the OEMs, and there's the four main ones, right? Let's talk PACCAR, Navistar, Volvo, and Daimler. Then you had this other vertical that was the fleets and the carriers, and then you had the shippers and the consignees. It was very clearly, everybody knew their lanes and everybody stayed in their paths, and that was the ecosystem, and it worked. And go back to 1995, all of a sudden we brought in the fourth vertical, which started as Dial-A-Truck. It was actually in a truck stop up off I-5 in the Northwest. It was a bulletin board that had index cards on it, and it had loads written up on it. And if you wanted to pull that load, you took that index card and you made the phone calls, and then you went and pulled that load. It was direct to the drivers that did that. So that's less than 30 years ago. Fast forward with the tech and there was a bunch of companies that moved into that space. And we've now got basically 20,000 companies that are in that vertical in between the carriers and fleets and the shippers and customers. And some of those 20,000 have done it through technology advancements. They've integrated instant payment for loads, and they've really enhanced the ability for the shippers and the customers to have full visibility of loads. They've made the fleets and carriers better in that aspect, made them adopt some change and some technology. But that's kind of how we had this equilibrium here for over the past 15 years or so, these brokers in this space. And it's always been an interesting relationship between the carriers and the fleets and the brokers. And, I got to use them. They're going to fill me up so that I can do the backhaul. I don't have to go tractor only. It's not great, but at least they gave me work. You've got a lot of that tenuous type of relationship. But if you look over the last 5 years or so, in between the OEMs and the shippers and the fleets, here comes the AV trucking companies. And now you've got basically 5 groups and verticals in there. And you've got a lot of shifting and moving that's taking place right now, right? So you've got traditional OEMs, right, that are, they may be looking at those AV trucking companies. How do I turn them into the classic tier 1 type of supplier? You've got some AV companies that are looking at that saying, wait a minute, is there a way I can commoditize the OEM product so that I can have my stack work on any truck? In fact, they're even taking some steps where they're jumping over the carriers and fleets and going directly to the brokers and committing 1 billion miles worth of capacity in the AV space. Some have gone over the carriers, and the brokers have gone straight to the shippers. And we've got this unique time right now of 5 verticals. And it's really interesting. Some of the OEMs are much more public in what they've put out there as far as where they're going and how they're going to turn that into transportation as a service. Others are keeping it much closer to their vest. So I am so happy I've got a front row seat on to watch this happen, because I don't know how it's going to shake out. And what I can guarantee you is 10 years from now, we can play back this podcast and those 5 verticals aren't going to stay the same. It just won't happen. There's going to be consolidation in the space. How does it happen? Who moves which way and what happens? There's a number of dynamics that are happening. The price points on both AV truck and the EV trucks, for that matter. We haven't even spent a lot of time talking about that today. That's a whole nother conversation for us. But you've got huge changes coming in that capital structure, and who's ready to take advantage of that? Who's best to hold that? So I think there's a number of things that need to play out. And I want to bring up a couple others that this kind of leads into their business model. You look at Ryder and Penske, they have a whole business model that's built on billions of dollars of investment every year in buying trucks. They buy a significant portion of the Freightliner build, the significant portion of the Navistar builds of all the carriers, all the OEMs, and then they turn around and they lease it. So they're ready. And they've got maintenance that they can offer. So who's going to move where? Grayson, I don't know how that's going to shake out right now, but I will tell you, if you're in that ecosystem and you're touching the supply chain, this dynamic and what's going to happen, it's going to impact you over the next 5 years.
Where does PACCAR fit into the mix? They've been a very conservative culture. They haven't been out front in autonomy. They're very hesitant to work with people. They're very publicly working with Aurora. What I keep hearing is Waymo's their golden goose, but Waymo's with Daimler, they're holding out for the Waymo one. But in all the research and due diligence that I've done, I can't see them playing a very large role as of today or even for the next couple of years because of their culture.
I think all four of those OEMs are going through their own individual strategy. What works for them? Where do they want to place their bets? But nothing's going to take them by surprise. I think all of the four OEMs are going to play in the EV tractor space. They're going to play in the AV space. It's just how, with whom, where, and what takes place. So it's going to be interesting to see this dynamic here over the next couple of years and how things move. It's a very unique time in the life cycle of the OEMs and what they're doing right now. They are at the forefront because they have to remain relevant, right? Because what they don't want to do is just become a commoditized commodity. They don't want to be in that lane. So they've got to position themselves for the future that includes AV adoption, ongoing traditional OEM products, and navigate this whole government regulation mandates with the EV structure. You know, these fleets are just upside down with what's taking place right now. They can't find duty cycles that work. They're not happy with the battery life cycles. There's so much disruption pointed at the OEMs right now because they've got to essentially reinvent what is trucking going to look like in terms of tractors and OEM roles 5 to 10 years from now.
What is trucking going to look like is a big question. You're right. If I'm running an OEM, I don't want to become the next Foxconn. No way, Jose, do I want to become the next Foxconn. Electrification is a big topic around Class 8 and trucking. And Lee, let's do this. Let's have you back on in the fall, and we're going to do another deep dive session all around electrification, because that's another hour and a half as we get into that. Today, the focus was autonomous trucking. We hit a complete home run on that. You gave a masterclass, sir. I always say that publicly and privately about you. You always give a masterclass on all things trucking, and today you gave one on autonomous trucking. Lee, summarizing this conversation, in your opinion, what is the future of autonomous trucking?
Grayson, 3 things, right? Let's understand that it's not going to be as fast as we thought, but it's going to be one lane at a time. It's going to be a very methodical and gradual adoption as we move forward. That's what's going to take place. I do believe it's going to be the most disruptive event to impact the supply chain that we've experienced in decades. But it's going to make a big difference in the top 50, top 100 lanes as we move forward in the future.
And it's going to have a positive impact on the global economy by creating jobs and lowering this thing that they said transitory, which is inflation. And it heck no, was not transitory. Autonomous trucking will create jobs. Autonomous trucking will lower inflation. And heck, bottom line is it's really great for the supply chain. Lee, as we look to wrap up this insightful conversation, what would you like our listeners to take away with them until next time this fall when we go into electrification?
Let me try to get this as quick as possible. 1, safety. We didn't spend a tremendous amount of time on that, but for the last 20 years, we have not moved the needle in safety. That's really what I'm still here for, is I know that autonomy and AV trucks are going to save lives. You look at what work the OEMs have done with the new equipment they've put on the trucks. They've done a phenomenal job at making it safer. There's more safety equipment on there, advanced driving systems with cruise control, just all sorts of improvements. You look at what the fleets have done with their training programs and the million-mile drivers and 25-year safe drivers, there's been some incredible advances in fleet commitment to safety, which has been awesome. And you look at it from the regulation standpoint with the electronic logs, with the consistency and construction zones and rules and procedures to make sure that process improves, and even like the drug and alcohol clearinghouse and what that has. So you look at that, we've done a lot of investments, but we haven't moved the needle on safety. We still have 5,000 fatalities and over 800 people in those trucks that got killed. I know AV trucking is going to move the needle on safety. Let's chase that. No matter where you sit in the ecosystem, I'll give you just AV trucking is going to impact you. If you're in the supply chain, if you're in the trucking ecosystem, it's going to hit you. And finally, get ready for that. I don't think it's going to be the big that eat the small as we go through this. It's going to be the fast that eat the slow. So how you get ready for this, how you prepare for this, what are the new jobs you need to get ready? How do you future-proof your operations and your business? It's almost like Chat GPT. You look around, everybody's got caught flat-footed with that. Nobody was really ready for that. Well, if somebody could have gone back 5 years and said, okay, in 2023, Chat GPT is going to be here. What changes do you need to make in order to adopt it and integrate it and make it a strategic advantage for your business? That's essentially what you and I are here today saying to the world. AV trucking's coming. Let's get ready for it. Grayson, thank you for having me on this.
You're very welcome, sir. AV trucking is here. AV trucking will save lives. AV trucking will create jobs. AV trucking will have a positive impact on the global economy. As Lee said, get ready. Autonomous trucks are coming. I say they're here. Get ready now. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is autonomous trucking. Lee, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy today.
Grayson, look forward to being with you again.
Looking forward to it as well, sir. Bye. If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed in the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices LLC to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.